By the mid-16th century, a legend is proliferating among the Spanish in the Americas of the existence of 7 cities of gold, the 7 cities of Cibola. And this legend is based on a story. And according to the story, 7 Christian bishops back in Spain, fleeing the Moors of Spain, had crossed the Atlantic at some point in the past and founded here 7 cities, a Christian realm that would become, fabulously wealthy. So this is something akin to the Prester John legend of the East. But in any case, you got these 7 cities, and their existence and their reality becomes a little more believable when several eyewitnesses, or at least those claiming first-hand knowledge, come forward to the authorities in New Spain. Add to that the fact that in recent memory, several conquests in the Americas have been insanely profitable. I mean, just a few decades earlier, the Aztecs had been conquered. And the gold and silver that had come from that conquest, it kicked off the largest gold rush in world history. I mean, this was believable stuff. A couple decades after that, and just a few years before Coronado would set out on his expedition, the Incas had been conquered. And again, hugely profitable in terms of gold and silver. So it just might be that these cities of gold actually existed. So a guy named Francisco Vázquez de Coronado was tasked with finding them and hopefully bringing them into the orbit of New Spain. So he sets out with a huge expedition, like 1,000 troops, 800 Mexican troops, 200 Spanish troops, and then slaves and animals. There were also 3 supply ships that followed as far as they could and ended up sailing up the Colorado River. So quite an expedition. He marches north, and eventually he gets to this area where in the distance he sees what looks like could be a city of gold, but it turns out to be a Pueblo city, a city made of stone and adobe. He sends expeditions out and scouting parties. They find a lot more Pueblo towns, but no cities of gold. One of the scouting parties actually finds the Grand Canyon, but no cities of gold. Well, that winter, things were tough. Coronado didn't really know how to take care of such a huge group in this arid region, so he forces some of the Pueblo peoples to outfit him, feed him, shelter him and his group. This breeds resentment, and eventually war breaks out between the two. And in the process, the Spanish burn several Pueblo towns and burn several Pueblo people as well. Well, by the spring, good news has arrived, news of plentiful gold to the north. And this news is being brought by a guy, again, who claims first-hand knowledge, the Pawnee, who the Spaniards call Turk. And so they follow Turk as their guide all the way up into what we today call Kansas. So he's right there in the interior of the continent. They have traveled a very, very far distance on foot. They get there, and unfortunately for them, and as we all know, there is no city of gold. In fact, the city of gold turns out to be a city of grass huts. So naturally, the Spaniards strangle poor Turk and turn around and go home. First they go to the Pueblo, return to the Pueblo, and then Coronado goes home to Mexico. Never having found any cities of gold, but having explored thousands of miles of previously uncharted territory. Well, after the failure of Coronado to find his cities of gold, it would have been easy to write off this whole region, the Southwest, as completely unprofitable and not worth anyone's time. It was filled with desert. The only people living here were Pueblo people for the most part. No cities of gold, no Aztecs, no Incas. And so it was ignored. It was ignored for decades until about 60 years after Coronado had gone home disappointed. Another man organized an expedition, this time not so much of gold seekers, but of settlers. These are soldier settlers, about 500 of them. And they march north along the Rio Grande with their 7,000 heads of cattle. I mean, they mean to settle. And they follow the Rio Grande all the way up to what we would call north central New Mexico. And there they find a cluster of Pueblo towns. They march into one of these Pueblo towns, kick out the inhabitants, and establish it as their base. They take possession of it for themselves. Juan de Oñate renames it San Juan, and it becomes his capital, his base, as he coordinates the conquest of the Pueblo peoples in the surrounding area. Now, of course, there's resistance, and in one memorable incident, 13 Spanish settlers, 13 Spanish soldiers, are killed by the Acoma Pueblo. And so in retaliation, Oñate attacks Acoma itself. The Pueblo itself is situated high up on a mesa top. And he goes up there with his army, attacks it. The battle rages fiercely for 3 days. But in the end, the Acoma are defeated. There are about 6,000 inhabitants of that Pueblo, Acoma Pueblo, up there on the mesa top. Probably 1 in 7 died in the 3-day battle. Hundreds more, men, women, children, are taken as slaves, while all of the Pueblo in the area, on Oñate's order, all the men above age 25 had their left foot cut off to prevent such resistance in the future. So Oñate could definitely be brutal. But he saw in this area, it was arid, it was desert, but he saw it as having great sheep herding potential. Meanwhile, the Franciscans were able to successfully establish missions in every pueblo along the Rio Grande up in that region. So the Spanish were here to stay. In the decades after Oñate had established Spanish rule here in New Mexico, the relationship that the Spanish have with the Pueblos, the various Pueblo peoples, well, the deal was this. The Spanish, they justified their rule and their overlordship by saying, we're going to protect you. And it's true that the Pueblos did require some sort of protection, perhaps. I mean, not only had they been mutually hostile to one another, speaking different languages, never considering themselves one people, they were often at odds with each other. The Spanish sort of ended that. But also, they were the frequent targets of Apache raids, of Navajo raids, and the Spanish offered some protection from such things. However, the Spanish required a lot in exchange for this supposed protection. They taxed the Pueblos quite heavily. Some of them ended up being a little more than slaves. And they required the Pueblos to stop practicing their traditional religion. No longer were they allowed to participate in, religious dances in their kivas. This is a kiva right here, a very large kiva. These are circular underground sort of pit houses. Think of them as temples. The Pueblos had been building these things for 1,500 years. And now they're not allowed to practice the old faith system, their old rituals in them. In fact, the Spanish priests would enforce this by invading the kivas. And if you were found practicing the old ways, you could be flogged. So they could be quite brutal. This builds up a lot of resentment among the various Pueblo peoples. There's still the protection aspect, so maybe they put up with it, in the meantime. However, in the 1660s, a drought hits the area. And the reason this is such a bad thing, besides the obvious, is that it drives the Navajo and the Apache to raid much more. And this time it seems the Spanish are unable to protect even themselves, let alone the Pueblos. The Navajo and the Apache are raiding consistently from the Pueblos and the Spanish, stealing horses, mules, food, all sorts of stuff. And this is the last straw. The Pueblos, they might put up with all sorts of things, but at least they have Spanish protection. Now even that is failing. Well, eventually, a guy named Pope rises up. This is in 1680. He rises up and he says, look, the old gods are offended. It's time we give up anything Spanish and go back to our old ways. We must. And the Spanish don't like this, and they take Pope and they accuse him of witchcraft and they whip him. Now, that's exactly the type of incident that can incite the locals against, foreign rulers. This type of thing happens throughout history. There's some spark. Well, this is the spark. All sorts of people join Pope's revolt, the Pueblo revolt, as it will be known later. They join his revolt. And this is significant because the Pueblo peoples, as I mentioned, historically not united, but now united against a common enemy, the Spanish. And ironically, using the Spanish language taught to them by their overlords as the means to communicate with one another. Like I mentioned previously, it was difficult for them to communicate with one another because they spoke different languages. Well, now they all speak Spanish. So the revolt is a success. the 2,000 Spanish settlers that are here, I mean, almost a quarter of them are murdered over the course of the revolt. And those who survive flee back to Mexico. So the revolt actually rids the area of the Spanish. And Pope sets himself up as a dictator. He takes residence in the old governor's palace, and he rules as a despot. He proclaims that all things Spanish must be done away with. If you're found even using a Spanish farm implement, you will be executed. So Pope rules this way until his death in 1688. Now it turns out that Pope himself was what had been holding the various Pueblo peoples together, because when he dies, that unity dissolves, they split. A lot of that mutual hostility comes back, and you hear a lot of Pueblos begin to pine, unbelievably, for the Spanish. They say, look, the Spanish gave us the horse, the Spanish gave us cattle and other animals, the Spanish taught us better ways to practice agriculture, they gave us better farm implements, they did protect us a lot better than we are protecting ourselves currently against the continued Navajo and Apache raids. So some people are pining for a Spanish return. The Spanish do return just a few years later. By 1692, they have completed their reconquest of New Mexico. And at this point, the Pueblos and the Spanish able to work out more of a cooperative relationship. Now, the Spanish still are the overlords, but they rule much less harshly. And in fact, the Spanish and the Pueblos end up really needing each other, not just against the Navajo and the Apache, but further down the line against the mighty Comanche. Thank you so much for watching to the end. I really appreciate that. If you want me to keep creating content like this, consider becoming my patron over on patreon.com. Also follow me on Instagram, where weekly I issue updates as well as a set of history challenges, a little more engagement there. It's a lot of fun. We'll see you there.